Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Ryan sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the stack of old film reels he had purchased at an estate sale earlier that day. He was a filmmaker, always searching for inspiration, and when he saw the unmarked reels collecting dust in a forgotten corner of the sale, he couldn't resist. Something about them felt off. The seller, an old man with sunken eyes, had looked at him strangely when he picked them up. "You sure you want those?" the man had asked, his voice hoarse. Ryan had laughed. "Yeah, I collect old film. You know what's on them?" The old man hesitated. Then, in a quieter tone, he said, "Some things should stay forgotten." Ryan had dismissed it as an attempt to spook him, but now, sitting in his dimly lit room, he couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. He lifted the top reel, its metal casing cold to the touch. There was no label, no indication of what was on it. Just rusted edges and a faint, lingering smell of decay. With a deep breath, he set up his projector, the hum of the machine filling the silence. The reel clicked into place, and the film sputtered to life against the blank wall. At first, the screen was black. Then a grainy image flickered on, an old house, standing alone in a vast, empty field. The film was silent, but Ryan could almost hear the wind rustling through the dead grass. The house looked familiar, though he couldn't place it. Then the image cut. A woman appeared, standing in a dark room, her back turned to the camera. Her long hair was unkempt, strands clinging to her pale skin. She was breathing heavily. Ryan leaned in, trying to see more details, but the footage was too distorted. The screen flickered again, and suddenly the woman turned. Her face was wrong, blurred, stretched, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Her eyes, black voids, seemed to look right through the screen, right at him. Ryan's breath caught. The projector whirred, the film stuttering. The screen went black again. He exhaled, rubbing his eyes. What the hell was that? As he reached to stop the projector, the film continued. The image that replaced the darkness made his stomach drop. It was his old house, the one he grew up in. Ryan froze, his pulse hammering. The house looked just as he remembered, 2 stories, peeling paint, the broken window his father never fixed. But this was impossible. How could a random, unmarked film reel have footage of his childhood home? He stared as the camera moved toward the front door, the frame shaking slightly, as if held by an unseen hand. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the house was dark, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the wooden floor. Then a figure stepped into view. A boy. Ryan's blood turned to ice. The boy was sitting on the floor, playing with a toy truck. He knew that truck, knew the way the paint was chipped on one side, because that boy was him. Ryan shot up from his chair, heart racing. "No way," he whispered. The boy in the film, his younger self, paused as if sensing something. Slowly, he turned toward the camera. His eyes met Ryan's through the screen. Then the boy whispered something. Ryan barely heard it over the hum of the projector, but it was enough to make his breath hitch. "He's watching." Ryan slammed the projector off. The room plunged into silence. His skin was clammy, his fingers trembling. He turned, expecting what? Someone standing behind him? The thought made his stomach churn. "This is a joke," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Some kind of old horror film. Just a coincidence." But he didn't believe that. Not really. Taking a deep breath, he gathered the reel and shoved it back into its case. He needed air. Needed to get away from the suffocating weight pressing against his chest. As he grabbed his jacket, his phone buzzed. A text. From an unknown number. Ryan hesitated before unlocking the screen. The message was simple. "Keep watching." His stomach flipped. He stared at the words, his fingers numb. Then another message came through. "Or he'll find you first." Ryan dropped his phone. It clattered against the wooden floor, the screen casting an eerie glow across the room. His breathing was shallow, panic rising in his throat. Who sent that? How did they know? Slowly, he reached down, picking up his phone with trembling fingers. He stared at the messages, willing them to disappear. Then, against his better judgment, he turned the projector back on. The film started again, picking up right where it left off. His younger self was still there, still staring at the camera. But something was different now. The shadows behind the boy were moving. Something else was in the house. Ryan's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. The boy in the film turned his head slightly, as if listening. Then he spoke again. "He's here." A chill ran down Ryan's spine. The camera in the film shifted, panning toward the hallway. There, at the end of the hall, stood a tall, shadowy figure. Ryan's mouth went dry. The figure had no face, no features, just a dark, looming presence that seemed to seep into the walls. The film flickered. The shadow moved. Ryan's breath caught as the figure took a step forward, then another. The closer it got, the more distorted the film became, the image warping, twisting. The boy in the film clutched his toy truck, his small frame trembling. Ryan wanted to turn it off. Every instinct screamed at him to stop watching. But he couldn't move. The shadow reached the boy, standing right behind him. Its arms stretched out, long and unnatural. Then, the boy turned to the camera one last time. His lips moved. Ryan barely heard it, but the words sent ice through his veins. "Run!" The film cut to black. Ryan shot up, his chair scraping against the floor. He turned, his breath ragged. The apartment was silent, the only sound his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, a soft creak. From the hallway. Ryan's head snapped toward the sound. The shadows near his bedroom door seemed darker, deeper. He took a slow step back. His phone buzzed again. He didn't want to look, but he did. One new message. Too late. Ryan's breath hitched. He glanced back at the hallway, dread pooling in his stomach. Then the light flickered, and something moved. Ryan's breath came in short, uneven gasps. His fingers clenched the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. The air in the apartment felt heavier now, pressing against his chest like an unseen weight. The hallway remained still. But he knew, he felt, it wasn't empty. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Open the door. Ryan's stomach churned. He glanced at his bedroom door, its edges swallowed by the thickening darkness. He wasn't going to open it. No way. His phone vibrated again. Now, a chill crawled up his spine. He swallowed hard and stepped back, resisting the urge to obey, resisting the strange pull in his gut. Then the projector flickered. The film started playing again, on its own. Ryan's eyes darted to the screen. The film had changed. It no longer showed his childhood home. Instead, it displayed a dimly lit hallway, his hallway. His blood ran cold. The film was showing his apartment. The image was grainy, but the angle was clear. It was as if a hidden camera had been placed just behind him. The footage was real-time. He saw himself on the screen, standing frozen by his desk, staring at the projection. And then, something moved behind him. Ryan spun around. Nothing. He turned back to the screen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The shadow in the film had moved closer, just at the edge of the hallway. His hands shook. His throat was dry. The figure on the screen took another step forward. A loud knock echoed through the apartment. Ryan flinched, his breath catching in his throat. The knock came again. This time, it wasn't from the bedroom door. It was from his front door. A cold wave of fear crashed over him. He didn't move, didn't breathe. His eyes flicked to the film, and his stomach clenched. The camera in the film was now facing his front door. A shadow loomed just outside. Ryan's phone vibrated in his hand. He looked down, his fingers trembling as he read the message. "Let me in." His pulse pounded in his ears. His body refused to move. Then, the doorknob turned. Ryan bolted. He lunged for the projector, slamming it off. The screen went black, the room instantly swallowed in silence. He stood there, panting, every muscle in his body locked in place. The doorknob stopped turning. Seconds passed. Then minutes. Nothing. Ryan didn't dare move. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. His ears strained for any sound, any shift in the darkness. Silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a shaky breath. Maybe it was over. Maybe. Click. The projector turned back on. Ryan's stomach lurched. He hadn't touched it. The film started playing again. And this time, it was showing him. Live. Ryan saw himself standing in the exact position he was in now, staring at the screen with wide, horrified eyes. But then, something else moved in the film. A shadow crept up behind him. Ryan's breath hitched. He turned. Darkness. He looked back at the screen. The shadow was closer now, almost right behind him. His heart slammed against his ribs. He couldn't move. In the film, his own body remained frozen. The shadow stretched toward him. Then, the Ryan on the screen moved. Not him, but his reflection in the film. Ryan on the screen turned his head and smiled, a jagged, unnatural grin. Ryan staggered backward, his vision blurring with panic. His reflection in the film was still smiling, still watching. Then the film flickered, and his reflection whispered, "Run!" The screen cut to black. The lights in the apartment shut off, and the whispers began. Ryan stood paralyzed in the pitch-black apartment. The whispers slithered through the air, too many voices speaking at once, too close to his ears. He couldn't make out the words, but they crawled into his head, pressing against his skull like cold fingers. His breathing was too loud. He tried to steady it, but his chest was tight, his lungs refusing to cooperate. Then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming from the hallway. Ryan's stomach twisted. His limbs finally obeyed, and he stumbled backward, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. The footsteps came closer. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound nearly sent him over the edge. He yanked it out with trembling hands, his fingers barely managing to unlock the screen. A new message. "Don't look." Ryan's throat went dry. The footsteps stopped. Right behind him. The air was ice cold now. His body locked up, his muscles screaming to move, to run. But the weight of the unseen presence behind him was suffocating. The screen of his phone dimmed, the battery draining rapidly. The message app flickered, as if struggling to stay open. Another message popped up. "If you look, you will see me. If you see me, you will never leave." Ryan squeezed his eyes shut. His entire body was trembling. He could feel it now, breath against his neck, too slow, too cold. A whisper, right at his ear. "You brought me back." Ryan couldn't stop the choked gasp that escaped him. His entire body screamed to run, but he was frozen, trapped in his own fear. The phone vibrated again. Another message. "Go to the film room. Now." His stomach twisted. The film room, where the reel had been playing. Ryan's mind screamed at him not to go, to get out of the apartment, to flee. But his feet were already moving, slow and unsteady, carrying him through the darkness. The presence behind him didn't follow, but he knew it was still there, watching, waiting. Ryan reached the film room, his fingers scrambling to find the switch. He flicked it on, and the bulb above flickered, barely holding on to life. The projector was still running, the reel spinning. The screen showed static now, but in the shifting gray and white fuzz, shapes were moving, shadows, distorted figures twisting in and out of focus. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. His fingers moved on their own, reaching toward the film reel. He didn't know why. Somewhere deep in his gut, he felt it. This film, it wasn't just playing, it was recording. A sharp, electric jolt ran through his fingers as soon as he touched the reel. He yanked his hand back with a sharp gasp, his skin tingling with static. The film changed. The static cleared. And now, Ryan was watching himself again. He was standing in the film room, just like he was now. But something was different. In the footage, past Ryan was smiling. The same unnatural, jagged grin he had seen before. Ryan shook his head, stepping away from the projector. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." The Ryan on screen took a step forward. Ryan took a step back. The past Ryan on the screen kept walking. Closer, closer, until his face filled the screen, his dead, hollow eyes staring straight at the real Ryan. A whisper crawled through the room. "Let me in." The lights flickered violently, the air buzzing with static electricity. Ryan stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of the carpet. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting up his spine. The projector whirred, the reel spinning faster. The screen, it was stretching. The film wasn't just playing anymore. It was opening. The surface of the screen rippled, darkening, twisting into something unnatural. It wasn't a projection anymore. It was a door, and something was stepping through. Ryan scrambled backward, his breath coming in panicked gasps. A shape emerged, shifting and flickering like it didn't belong in this world. It was him, the past Ryan from the film. The grin stretched wider. His mouth moved, whispering words Ryan couldn't hear. Then, the figure lunged. Ryan screamed. Ryan scrambled backward, his hands scraping against the floor as the figure lunged from the screen. His chest tightened with sheer terror as the past Ryan stretched forward, his form glitching and flickering, his limbs distorting as if he were still trapped within the film. Ryan kicked wildly, his foot slamming into the projector stand. The machine wobbled, the reel sputtering, but it didn't stop. The figure from the screen didn't stop. The light in the room dimmed. The air grew heavier, pressing down on Ryan's chest. The static buzzed louder, filling his ears, making it impossible to think. Then, the lights went out. Pitch black. Silence. Ryan's breathing was the only thing he could hear, ragged and panicked. He reached out blindly, his fingers searching for anything solid, anything real. The floor beneath him felt wrong. Too smooth. Too cold. A whisper right in his ear. "You shouldn't have watched." Ryan spun around, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone. The screen lit up in the darkness, but before he could even check it, a face appeared in the glow. His own. But it wasn't a reflection. The past Ryan was inches from his face, his hollow, lifeless eyes locked onto him. Ryan screamed, dropping the phone. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the light flickering. The room shifted around him. The walls stretched, distorting like melted wax. The projector whirred faster, the film reel spinning out of control. Ryan forced himself to move, to get to his feet, to run. His body felt like it was wading through thick air, like something unseen was pulling at him, trying to drag him down. He reached the door, his fingers barely wrapping around the handle before. Hands grabbed him. Cold. Too many. Crawling up his arms, locking around his wrists, his neck, his chest. The whispers grew louder. "Let us out. You brought us back. Finish the film." Ryan thrashed, his body twisting in sheer panic. He couldn't breathe. The hands were pulling him down, dragging him toward the screen. No, not a screen anymore. A hole. A doorway into somewhere else. Ryan gasped for air, his vision blurring as his body was yanked forward. He could feel himself being pulled inside, the world around him dissolving into static. Then, a sound. A knock. Sharp. Echoing. Everything froze. The hands let go. The static cut off. Ryan collapsed to the floor, his chest heaving. His skin burned where the hands had gripped him. Another knock. From the front door. Ryan's mind reeled. Who? His limbs screamed in protest as he pushed himself up, stumbling toward the hallway. His breath hitched as he reached the entrance, his shaking fingers hovering over the lock. A voice from the other side. Soft. Familiar. Ryan opened the door. His blood ran cold. It was his mother's voice. But that was impossible. She had been dead for 10 years. Ryan took a shaky step back. The peephole. He could check the peephole. He swallowed hard, his heart hammering as he leaned forward, pressing his eye to the tiny glass circle. Outside, nothing. Just the hallway, stretching dimly under the flickering apartment lights. Ryan exhaled shakily. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe none of this was real. Then, a shadow shifted just outside the peephole. Not walking, not moving, growing. Ryan jerked away just as the voice came again. "Ryan, let me in." This time, it was his own voice. The lights in the apartment exploded, shattering into darkness. And behind him, the film projector clicked back on. Ryan turned slowly, his entire body trembling. On the screen, a door. His door. The film showed someone standing outside, their back turned to the camera. Then slowly, the figure turned around. Ryan's stomach twisted. It was him. But something was wrong. The grin was too wide. The eyes were too empty. The screen flickered. The figure on the film knocked. The sound echoed through the apartment. Knock, knock, knock. Ryan staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. His phone vibrated on the floor. He barely registered it, his shaking hands reaching for it. A new message. "Do not open the door." Ryan's vision blurred, panic making his thoughts scatter. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Another message. "Whatever you do, do not watch the next scene." Ryan's stomach dropped. His eyes darted back to the screen. The film kept playing, and now, it was showing the inside of his apartment. Right where he was standing. Ryan couldn't move. His breath hitched as he stared at the flickering film on the screen. It showed him, standing in the middle of his apartment, staring at the screen, just like he was doing now. But there was something wrong. The version of him in the film wasn't alone. A shadow loomed behind him. Ryan's stomach twisted into knots. His entire body turned ice cold. Slowly, terrified to look, he forced himself to turn his head. The air behind him was heavy, thick, wrong. The lights flickered weakly, barely illuminating the darkened room. Nothing. No one there. But he could feel it. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. His phone vibrated again. The screen's dim glow cast eerie shadows on the floor. His hands trembled as he picked it up. Another message. "Do not turn around again." Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. He looked at the screen again, at the thing behind his film self. It moved closer, its shape distorting, twisting. The film crackled, the static growing louder. His film self turned slowly, as if sensing the presence behind him. Ryan felt it, like a cold breath on the back of his neck. His vision blurred. He couldn't think. His body screamed for him to run, but he was frozen in place. Then, the film flickered. His film self opened his mouth. And then, the film screamed. A guttural, distorted, inhuman shriek. Ryan stumbled backward, his ears ringing. The screen convulsed, the image warping violently. The screaming didn't stop, like 100 voices crying out at once. The projector's bulb burst, plunging the room into darkness. Ryan collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. His hands clutched at his head, his mind spiraling into chaos. Then, silence. A cold, suffocating silence. Ryan's entire body trembled. The room was pitch black, and the only sound was the ragged rise and fall of his breathing. Then, in the dark, a soft whisper, right next to his ear. "You are in the film now." Ryan screamed. He scrambled forward, knocking over furniture, crashing into walls. His hands fumbled wildly for his phone, for light, for anything to prove he was still here, still real. His fingers wrapped around the device. He clicked the flashlight on. A dim beam illuminated the apartment. The projector was still there, but the film was no longer running. The reel hung limply, unmoving. The screen was blank. But there was something new. A single sentence was scratched into the screen's surface. "Find the final reel." Ryan swallowed hard, his throat dry. The final reel? What did that mean? His mind raced. There was no final reel. This was the only one he found, wasn't it? No. Something stirred in his memory. The box. When he first found the reel in the storage room, there had been another container beside it. A second case, one he hadn't thought to check. Ryan's chest tightened. He had to go back. His phone vibrated again. A new message. Hurry. You don't have much time. Ryan's breath caught. Time for what? Before he could think, before he could even breathe, the air in the apartment shifted. The lights flickered back on, but they weren't normal. They were red. A deep, blood-colored glow soaked the room. The walls seemed to pulse, like they were breathing. Ryan's phone screen glitched. The text distorted, the words melting into unreadable symbols. The temperature plunged, his breath coming out in visible puffs of air. Then, a thump. From the hallway. Ryan's stomach twisted. He turned toward the door, his hands shaking. Another thump. Closer this time. Then, a single word scratched across his phone screen. Run. Ryan didn't hesitate. He bolted. He sprinted through the apartment, grabbing his keys and phone in one swift motion. His fingers fumbled at the lock, his breathing ragged. Behind him, the thumping in the hallway grew louder. It wasn't footsteps. It was heavier. Wrong. The door refused to open. Ryan's pulse pounded. His shaking hands twisted the knob furiously, but it wouldn't budge. Then, from the other side of the door, a whisper. Soft. Familiar. Ryan. His stomach dropped. He knew that voice. His mother. He hadn't heard it in years. Not since she. No. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His mother was dead. Ryan pressed his back against the door, shaking. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out, to do something. Then, knocking. Soft. Rhythmic. 3 slow taps. His vision blurred. His entire body was ice cold. His mother used to knock like that when checking on him as a child. Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. You're not real. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, slam. Something pounded against the door with such force that the wood splintered. The entire frame shook violently, rattling in place. Ryan stumbled backward, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His phone buzzed in his hand. A new message. Don't open it. Go now. Ryan turned, sprinting to the fire escape. He shoved the window open, his pulse hammering as he climbed out. The night air was freezing. The city below was quiet, eerily still. He didn't stop to think. He descended fast, gripping the cold metal rungs as he made his way down. His muscles burned, his hands slipping slightly on the damp railing. Above him, a creak. The window opened. Ryan didn't dare look up. He kept climbing, heart hammering. The street was close, just a few more steps. Then, a low exhale, right above him. Slow, ragged. Something was leaning out of his window, watching him. Ryan's stomach twisted into knots. He jumped the last few rungs, landing hard on the pavement. His ankle twisted painfully, but he forced himself to run. The storage unit. He had to get back to the storage unit. His car was parked a block away. Every shadow along the street felt too long, too still. The air was too quiet, like the entire world was holding its breath. Ryan fumbled with his keys, hands trembling as he yanked the car door open and threw himself inside. He locked the doors. His breathing was shaky. His skin was ice cold. For a moment, he sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. Then, his radio crackled. Ryan's blood turned to ice. The station wasn't on. The screen was dark. The car was silent. But the whispering started anyway. Soft. Hushed. Right behind him. Ryan refused to turn around. A voice, his mother's, whispered, "You can't leave." The back seat creaked. Ryan slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as he peeled out onto the road. speeding toward the storage facility. His hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, his pulse hammering in his ears. The whispering faded. The car interior felt empty again. But Ryan knew he wasn't alone. He drove faster. The storage facility loomed ahead, its metal structures towering like skeletal remains in the dim streetlights. Ryan skidded into the lot, barely parking before stumbling out of the car. The air felt heavier here. He sprinted to the storage unit, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the door and shoved it open. Inside, rows of old boxes, stacks of forgotten film reels, dust thick in the air. Ryan searched wildly, shoving boxes aside, his movements frantic. Then, he saw it, the second film reel. It was sitting in the back of the storage unit, unmarked, dust-covered. But there was something else. A third case. Ryan's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen that before. His phone buzzed. A new message. Play them. But be ready. Ryan swallowed hard. He grabbed the reels. He was going to end this. Ryan grabbed both reels, his hands shaking. His body felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on him, watching his every move. The air inside the storage unit was thick and suffocating, carrying a faint chemical smell, like old film stock left to decay. He stumbled backward, clutching the reels, his breath unsteady. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Play the third one last. Ryan's heart pounded. The third reel. He had never seen it before. He wasn't even sure how it had gotten here. The case was identical to the others, dusty, unmarked, wrong. A part of him wanted to throw them all away, burn them, destroy them. But he knew that wouldn't work. The first reel had followed him home. It had started something. And now there was only one way to end it. Ryan rushed to his car, tossing the reels into the passenger seat. His fingers fumbled at the ignition. The engine groaned, then roared to life. He pulled out of the storage lot fast, tires screeching against the pavement. The streetlights above flickered as he sped past. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the corners of his vision, but he refused to look. He had to get back to his apartment, had to finish what he started. The drive felt longer this time. The city outside his window looked different. The streets were too empty, the buildings too dark. His phone buzzed. He didn't want to look, but he did. A new message. Don't stop, no matter what you see. Ryan swallowed hard. Then, the headlights caught something in the road. A figure, standing in the center of the intersection, completely still. Ryan's breath hitched. His foot hovered over the brake. Then he saw her face. His mother, standing in the middle of the street. Pale, expressionless, wrong. Her eyes were too dark, her mouth slightly open, as if she was whispering something he couldn't hear. Ryan's hands clenched the wheel. His entire body screamed at him to stop. But the text, don't stop, no matter what you see. He pressed his foot harder on the gas. His mother's figure didn't move. Then, just before impact, she smiled. Ryan braced for the hit, but the car passed right through her. Ice filled his veins. His fingers were numb. His whole body felt wrong, like the world had just shifted slightly out of place. He didn't slow down, didn't look back. His apartment building finally came into view, looming against the night sky. The windows were dark, except for one. His window. Something was standing there. Ryan didn't stop to think. He pulled into the lot, threw the car into park, and grabbed the reels. His heartbeat pounded in his skull as he rushed inside. The hallways felt too quiet, too long. His footsteps echoed. He reached his door. It was open. A sliver of darkness stretched from inside his apartment. The light in the living room was flickering. Ryan stepped inside. The air was freezing. His apartment smelled like chemicals, like old film. He walked toward the projector, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The reels felt heavier in his hands. Ryan set up the first reel. The film flickered to life. The footage was different this time. It showed a house, a dimly lit room, a woman sitting on the floor, her face hidden in her hands. Ryan's stomach twisted. He recognized that house. It was his childhood home. On the screen, the woman looked up. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. It was his mother. But her eyes, they were black voids. Her mouth moved, forming silent words. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward him. Ryan's phone buzzed. A new message. Keep watching. Ryan clenched his fists, his whole body rigid. His mother's image twitched, the film distorting for a brief second. Then suddenly, the screen cut to black. The reel jammed, the projector making a horrible whirring noise. The film was stuck, the tape caught in the gears. Ryan lunged forward, trying to fix it. But then, from behind him, a whisper. Soft. Familiar. Close. Ryan. His blood turned to ice. He wasn't alone. The whisper came from the corner of the room. Slowly, Ryan turned his head, and someone was standing there, watching him. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The figure stood in the dark corner of the room, just outside the reach of the flickering projector light. He couldn't see its face, but he felt its eyes on him. He tried to move, but he couldn't. His body was frozen. His limbs refused to obey. Then the whisper again. Soft. Familiar. Ryan. His stomach twisted. It was his mother's voice. But she was dead. The figure took a step forward. Ryan's chest tightened. His breath came in shallow gasps. His fingers dug into the arm of the couch, knuckles white. The film projector whirred. The reel unstuck itself. The screen flickered back to life. Ryan's eyes darted toward it, desperate for something, anything, to break the moment. The footage had changed. It was his old bedroom. The camera was moving now, creeping toward his bed like it was being held by someone. The door was cracked open. There was a shadow standing in the hallway. The air in the apartment turned thick, suffocating. Ryan's phone buzzed. He forced himself to look. A new message. Don't turn around. His blood ran cold. Behind him, the whisper came again, closer this time. Ryan, look at me. His fingers trembled. His throat was too dry to swallow. He stared at the screen. On the film, the shadow moved closer to the camera. The door creaked open another inch. Ryan's hands clenched into fists. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. The figure behind him shifted. A sound like bare feet on wood. Ryan shut his eyes. He couldn't turn around. The footage on the screen trembled. The image glitched, black streaks and warping distortions. The camera in the film moved forward, stepping into the bedroom. Ryan's childhood bed was there. The sheets were rumpled, the pillow indented. Someone was under the covers. Ryan's entire body tensed. The figure on the screen, the thing in the hallway, was getting closer. The camera panned down, lowering toward the bed. The whisper came again, but now it was in his ear. Turn around, Ryan. Ryan gritted his teeth. The screen flickered. The camera stopped at the edge of the bed. The lump under the covers shifted. Ryan's stomach twisted into knots. He already knew what was coming. The covers in the film began to pull back, slow, jerky movements, as if something underneath was struggling to push them away. Ryan couldn't breathe. The sheets slid down further, revealing a hand. Then, the screen glitched violently. The image froze. The film jammed again, the sound of twisting tape filling the room. Ryan's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what was next. He had lived this before. And if the film continued, if it showed what came next, he would see himself, a child lying in bed, and something standing over him. The whisper in his ear was no longer soft. It was inside him. Turn around, Ryan. His phone buzzed. He snapped his eyes open. A new message. Run. The apartment lights shattered. A scream, distorted, agonized, inhuman, ripped through the room. Ryan bolted. He didn't look back. Didn't stop. He tore through the apartment, yanking open the front door, feet pounding down the hallway. His pulse was a drum in his skull, his breath ragged. The hallway lights flickered violently, warping as he ran. The walls seemed to stretch, the corridor growing longer and longer. His phone buzzed again. He didn't want to look, but he had to. You can't escape it. Ryan's throat tightened. He ran harder. He reached the stairwell, nearly tripping as he stumbled down the steps. He crashed through the lobby doors into the cold night air. The city outside was empty, dead silent. Ryan gasped for breath, his hands on his knees. His mind was spinning. His body trembled. He glanced at his phone again. Another message. Watch the third reel. Ryan's stomach twisted. The third reel. He had it in his car. His hands shook as he fumbled for his keys, sprinting toward the vehicle. He yanked the door open, grabbed the reel from the passenger seat. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at it. His fingers brushed the dusty surface, unmarked, like the others. But somehow he knew this one was different. Ryan swallowed. He had to finish it. He had to know. His apartment was no longer an option. He needed somewhere else to watch it, a place where it couldn't reach him. Ryan's eyes flicked toward the distance. The old abandoned theater. It had been shut down for years. Empty. Forgotten. He knew the back entrance was still unlocked. His pulse pounded. His breath was shaky. Ryan clutched the reel tightly and climbed into the car. He had one last film to watch. One last piece of the puzzle. And he knew deep down, this was going to be the worst one of all. The drive to the abandoned theater was eerily silent. Ryan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The city felt wrong. No cars. No people. Just empty streets stretching endlessly under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. His phone buzzed again. His heart lurched. He hesitated before looking. Almost there. His breath hitched. Who was sending these messages? Was it watching him? He swallowed hard, pressing the gas pedal a little further. The theater loomed ahead, its once grand entrance now a shadow of what it used to be. The letters on the marquee had long since fallen away, leaving only a skeletal frame. The doors were locked from the front, but he knew the back way in. Ryan parked, gripping the film reel as he stepped out. His breath formed pale clouds in the cold air. The alley behind the theater was too quiet. His footsteps echoed louder than they should have. The rusted door groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something else, something stale, like the breath of something long dead but still lingering. His footsteps crunched against the old carpet. The grand auditorium was just ahead. Rows of rotting seats sat in perfect stillness, facing the massive screen that had once brought stories to life. Now it was just an empty void. Ryan swallowed hard. At the back of the room, the old projection booth loomed above. He could already feel his pulse hammering. He forced himself forward. The stairs leading up to the booth creaked under his weight. The door was slightly open, as if someone had been here recently. Ryan stepped inside. The room was cold. Dust swirled in the beam of his flashlight. The old projector sat in the center of the booth, wires tangled like veins. The film reels on the shelf were coated in a thick layer of grime, except for one spot, like something had been taken recently. Ryan set the third reel onto the projector. His fingers trembled as he threaded the film through. Then he hesitated. His phone buzzed again. He nearly dropped it. Another message. Are you sure? Ryan sucked in a sharp breath. He wasn't sure, but it was too late to turn back now. His shaking hand pressed the switch. The projector hummed to life. The film flickered onto the massive screen below. Ryan leaned forward, gripping the edge of the console. His breath was shallow. The footage was different this time. Not grainy. Not aged. It looked recent. His stomach dropped. It was his apartment. Ryan's hands clenched into fists. The footage was moving, like someone was filming, walking slowly through his living room. Ryan's head pounded. Who had recorded this? The camera in the film turned toward the couch. Ryan froze. He was in the footage, sitting there, watching the first reel. His breath came in short, uneven gasps. He watched himself, unaware, as the camera in the footage crept closer, closer, closer. Then the angle shifted. The camera wasn't filming him anymore. It was filming behind him. Ryan's blood turned to ice. In the footage, something was standing right behind him. A dark shape. Tall, hollow, twisted. His fingers dug into the control panel. He remembered that night. He had felt something, but he hadn't turned around. The footage continued. The thing behind him didn't move, just stood there, watching. Then the camera tilted up. For the first time, Ryan saw its face. His vision blurred. His breath hitched. It was him, but wrong. His reflection, but distorted. Empty. The thing in the footage leaned down, inches from his unaware self. Its lips moved. No sound came out. Ryan's hands shook. He could barely breathe. Then, the film glitched violently. Static ripped across the screen. The images twisted, melting together in a grotesque blur. Ryan took a step back. His phone vibrated, once, twice, then again. New messages flooded in. Don't move. It knows you're watching. Don't turn around. Ryan stopped breathing. His skin prickled. Something was behind him. The whisper came again, barely a breath against his ear. Ryan. He clenched his teeth. His entire body was screaming to run, but he couldn't. He stared at the film. The screen flickered. The footage changed. It was now the theater, the very room he was standing in. His own silhouette stood in the projection booth, a dark shape against the light. And behind him, another shadow, a tall, twisted reflection. Its head tilted. Its lips moved. Ryan heard it inside him. Turn around. The lights in the theater exploded. The screen ripped. The last thing Ryan saw before everything went black was himself, smiling. But it wasn't his smile. Ryan fell. Darkness swallowed him whole. His body hit the floor hard, but it didn't feel real. The ground beneath him was cold, but not solid, like he had dropped into something deeper than just the projection booth. His ears were ringing. His vision blurred. Where was he? He pushed himself up, breathing hard. The air was thick, suffocating wrong. Then he realized he wasn't in the theater anymore. The walls stretched endlessly, flickering between shadows and static. The ceiling was too high, shifting like film caught in a broken reel. The floor beneath him wasn't wood, wasn't carpet, just an infinite abyss of shifting black. Ryan swallowed, forcing himself to stand. A whisper slithered through the dark. You're here. Ryan's chest tightened. The voice was his own. He turned. A figure stood a few feet away, barely visible against the flickering dark. It was him, but not. It had his face, his eyes, his height, but it wasn't real. Its skin was smooth, too perfect. Its smile stretched too wide. Its eyes were empty, just deep, endless black voids. Ryan's breath hitched. The thing took a step closer. You shouldn't have watched it, it said. Its voice was his, but wrong. Ryan's hands clenched. Who are you? The thing's grin didn't falter. I am you, it whispered. And you are me. Ryan shook his head. No. Another step closer. You let it in, the thing said, tilting its head. The moment you played the first reel. The moment you looked too deep. You saw what you weren't supposed to see. And now, it raised a hand. You belong to it. Ryan's pulse pounded. His head felt hollow. His body wasn't his own. His fingers twitched. His heartbeat slowed. His breath came in fragments. Something inside him was changing. The static around him tightened. The walls collapsed inward. The world was rewriting itself. And Ryan realized he was being filmed. A camera was rolling somewhere, capturing every moment. But who was watching? Ryan's breath hitched. The darkness around him shifted, wrapping itself tighter, colder, pressing in. His limbs trembled, but he couldn't escape it. His mind spun in dizzying circles. The thing in front of him, his reflection, his shadow, his doppelganger, took another step forward, its fingers trailing through the air like they were tasting it. "You thought you could run," it whispered, voice breaking like brittle glass. "But the real doesn't let you go." Ryan's stomach churned. The memories flooded back, his childhood, the house, his mother, the old film projector in the attic that his father had once used. The reels his father had kept hidden. It wasn't just the film he had found. It was the family curse, the same curse that had haunted every generation before him. He had thought it was just a relic, just an old piece of forgotten history. But it was more than that. The film reel was a door, a portal to something beyond, something that shouldn't be looked at, not by anyone. "You were always meant to find it," the thing in front of him said, its voice growing more distorted. "But now you're stuck, just like your father, just like your mother, just like them all." Ryan couldn't breathe. His vision blurred. The walls pulsed with the sound of scratching, like nails on glass. His hands shot out, grabbing at the void around him, but his fingers slipped through it, like it wasn't there at all. His body felt weightless, like he was falling, and yet standing still at the same time. He tried to scream, but no sound came. Then, the projector light flared. The world twisted. The room trembled. The thing in front of him grinned wider, impossibly wider, and its eyes, those endless pits, glowed. "You are the film now," it said, its voice a shriek. And in that moment, Ryan understood. The curse wasn't just in the film. The curse was in him. Ryan's body lurched, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The world around him cracked open like brittle glass, and for a split second, he could see the entire universe reflected in the shattered pieces. Everything he had ever known. The past, the present, the future, all of it folding in on itself. And then, everything went black. When Ryan awoke, he wasn't sure where he was. His eyes fluttered open, the world too quiet, too still. The air was stale, like the heavy scent of old film reels, like dust. It was as though he were floating, suspended in an endless, suffocating calm. His head throbbed, and his body ached as if it had been torn apart and put back together in a way that didn't quite fit. He blinked, forcing his eyes to focus. He was lying on the floor of the projection booth, the theater. But the theater was no longer a ruin. It was pristine, as if it had never aged. The seats, the walls, the screen, all of it perfectly preserved in a silence that felt far too deliberate. He sat up, gasping for air, his hands shaking. The walls seemed to stretch around him, taller, wider, endless. The room wasn't the same. There were no exits, no doors, no windows. The film reel, the cursed reel. He remembered. The truth. Ryan's hand trembled as he reached for the projector on the floor beside him. The film reel was still there, as though nothing had happened, as though it had never moved, never caused any of the horrors. But Ryan knew better now. The film wasn't just a recording. It was a trap, a never-ending cycle of doom. He fumbled to stand, the reel in his hand, and his gaze instinctively shifted toward the screen. The film was already playing, flickering to life without his command. And there, on the screen, he saw himself. Not the old version of him. Not the confused man who had stumbled across this cursed film. No, he saw the version of himself that had never existed. The version that was still sitting, still watching, still waiting. The face staring back at him was smiling. A perfect, familiar smile, but it wasn't his. It was too wide, too dark. The words appeared across the screen in blood-red letters. "You never escape. You only play." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, and he tried to scream, but no sound came. His voice was lost as everything else in this place. It wasn't real, and yet it was all too real. The walls, the film, his own reflection, they were all part of the same nightmare. He turned around. The door, the one that had never been there before, was now standing wide open. He rushed to it, desperate to leave, But as he reached for the handle, a new figure stepped into view. His own reflection again, but this time, the figure wasn't smiling. It was grinning. "No matter where you go," it said, its voice like 1,000 whispers, "the film will always find you." Ryan's body froze as the door swung shut, cutting him off from any escape. The screen behind him flickered violently, and he felt the ground beneath him pulling away. The lights dimmed, and the film continued to play. The same endless, looping scene, the same trapped story that he could never escape. Because the reel was not just a film. It was a prison, and now he was part of it. Name of the next story: The House at the Edge of the Void. When the Thompsons moved into their new home, they expected peace, quiet, suburban life in a house that had stood for generations. The house sat on a small hill, perched above the town like a watchful eye, with a large backyard that seemed to stretch on forever. It was isolated, nestled against a dense forest, the kind of place you could retreat to if you wanted to escape the noise of the world. It had been in the family for years, a sprawling estate that had once belonged to Henry Thompson's great-grandfather, who had passed it down through the generations. The house itself was a grand Victorian-style mansion, with tall windows and gabled roofs that seemed to reach toward the sky. The walls creaked with the weight of history, the floors groaning as if they were alive. Henry had always known that the house was old, but he had never imagined it would feel so alive. His wife, Emily, was less enthusiastic. She had grown up in a more modern house, and the idea of living in such an ancient place unsettled her. She didn't like the way the walls seemed to sigh at night, or the way the shadows stretched too long in the corners of the rooms. Still, she pushed those feelings aside, reminding herself that this was a fresh start for the family. Their son, Jacob, was the most excited. He was just 7 years old and saw the house as a place of endless possibility. He imagined adventures in the sprawling garden, exploring the woods behind the house, and discovering all the secret rooms he was certain the house must contain. Little did they know, it was the house that would be discovering them. On their first night there, the house seemed to settle around them. Henry unpacked boxes in the study, while Emily prepared dinner in the kitchen. The air was cold for a spring evening, and the house felt like it was breathing in a way that made Emily uncomfortable. She kept hearing soft noises behind her, footsteps when no one was around, whispers when no one spoke. "Everything all right?" Henry asked, stepping into the kitchen. His voice startled her out of her thoughts. She forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired. This house is bigger than I thought." Henry nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong either. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that seemed to press in from all sides, making it hard to breathe. He glanced at the window, noticing the way the trees swayed outside, though there was no wind. It was then that they heard it. A loud bang echoed through the house, followed by a low, dragging sound. Emily froze, her hands trembling. Henry set down the dish he was holding. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Probably just the house settling," Henry replied, though even he wasn't sure. The sound had been too distinct, too deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the floor above them. "Maybe we should check on Jacob," Emily said, worry creeping into her voice. They both made their way upstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The house seemed to groan with every step they took. As they approached Jacob's room, they heard him talking softly, his voice muffled through the door. Henry knocked gently, pushing the door open. Jacob was sitting on his bed, facing the window. "What's going on, buddy?" Henry asked, walking into the room. Jacob turned, his face pale. "I heard something," he said in a small voice, his eyes wide with fear. "It sounds like someone's walking around in the walls." Emily stepped closer, rubbing Jacob's back. "Sweetheart, you're probably just hearing things. This house is very old, remember? It makes a lot of strange noises." Jacob shook his head. "No, Mom. It's not just the house. It's something else. Henry frowned. What do you mean? Jacob hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. It's like the house is alive. It's watching me. The air in the room seemed to shift. A cold draft blew through the window, though it wasn't open. Emily turned, glancing nervously at the walls, but saw nothing. Jacob, that's just your imagination. But Jacob wasn't looking at his parents anymore. His gaze was fixed on the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. Suddenly, there was another bang from upstairs, followed by that dragging noise again, but this time it was closer. The sound seemed to come from just behind the walls, as though something, or someone was moving inside. Henry's heart skipped a beat. Okay, that's not normal, he said, turning to Emily. We need to find out what's going on. Henry, let's just get out of here, Emily said, panic creeping into her voice. This place it's not safe. But Henry shook his head. We can't leave, Emily. Not yet. We'll figure it out. They moved cautiously down the hallway, the air growing thicker, the temperature dropping with every step. The sounds grew louder, more urgent, and Henry's breath came in shallow gasps. They reached the top of the stairs, and as they descended, Emily swore she saw something, a figure, just a shadow, darting across the hallway. She gasped, grabbing Henry's arm. Did you see that? Henry turned, but there was nothing there. You're just imagining things. The house is playing tricks on you. But Emily wasn't convinced. Something was wrong, and it was coming from somewhere deep inside the house. Suddenly, the house seemed to groan once again, louder this time, like it was waking up. Henry felt the floor beneath his feet tremble, and for a split second, he could have sworn he saw the walls shifting, stretching outward. The house was alive, and it was beginning to stir. The tremors beneath their feet grew stronger. Henry's grip tightened on the railing as they made their way down the stairs, the sound of the house creaking louder now, like the groan of a living thing trying to break free. Emily's eyes darted nervously around the hallway, but there was no sign of movement. Let's just get to the basement, Henry said, his voice a bit shaky. We'll check the foundations. Maybe there's something down there causing all this. Emily nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. She wasn't sure a cracked foundation could explain the screaming silence that seemed to engulf the house whenever they moved. The air was oppressive, heavy with something they couldn't name. Jacob's footsteps behind them were slow, deliberate. Dad, I don't want to go to the basement, he whispered, his voice trembling. Henry paused, turning to look at his son. It's okay, Jacob. We're just going to check the pipes. We need to be sure the house is okay. But Jacob shook his head. It's not the pipes, Dad. It's the walls. He pointed to the hallway ahead of them, his finger trembling. It's inside the walls. Before Henry could respond, the lights flickered overhead. The house seemed to hum with energy, a deep, vibrating sound that made their skin crawl. The flickering intensified until the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Emily gasped, her hands reaching for Henry in the void. The darkness was alive, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. In the silence, they could hear it again, the scraping sound. A soft, wet noise that seemed to come from deep inside the walls, dragging itself across the floors and up the stairs. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Henry, what is that? I don't know, he whispered, his voice tight. Stay close. But Jacob wasn't with them anymore. They both turned, their hearts skipping a beat when they saw the empty space where their son had been standing just moments before. Jacob? Emily called out, panic rising in her chest. She felt a cold breath against the back of her neck and spun around, but there was no one there. Henry rushed to the end of the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He looked down the stairs leading to the basement, but something stopped him. Something made him hesitate. It was as if the house itself was watching them, keeping them from moving forward. Henry, what's happening? Emily asked, her voice trembling with fear. Where's Jacob? Then they heard it, a soft giggle, faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from behind the wall. a strange, hollow sound that echoed through the entire house. "Mom, Dad." Jacob's voice came from behind the wall, but his words were distorted, twisted, as if being pulled through some terrible filter. "Help me." Emily's heart nearly stopped. "Jacob!" she screamed, her voice rising in desperation. She pushed against the wall in front of her, but it didn't give way. The cold, wet scraping sound continued, moving along the walls, and suddenly she heard another voice. It wasn't Jacob's. It was deep, guttural, almost inhuman. "You can't leave." Henry stepped back, his mind racing. "We need to find him. Now." They rushed toward the nearest door, the one leading to the parlor. As they approached, the door slammed shut with a force that nearly knocked them over. Emily screamed, stumbling back, her hands instinctively reaching for Henry, her eyes wide with fear. The walls around them seemed to shift again. The house was no longer just a house. It was alive, breathing, moving. The hallway stretched out before them, impossibly long, and the floor beneath their feet groaned as if it were crawling. "Henry, we need to get out of here," Emily cried, pulling at his sleeve. But before they could take another step, the door to the basement creaked open. The soft, dragging noise was louder now, closer. The air grew colder, and the stench of something foul, something decaying, flooded their senses. Then Jacob's voice echoed again, clearer this time, but twisted with pain and fear. "It's in the walls, Mom. It's hungry. It wants me." Emily rushed to the basement door, her feet slipping on the floor as she ran. Henry followed close behind, his pulse racing. As they descended the stairs into the darkness, the air became thicker, almost tangible, like it was pushing against them. It felt as though the house was trying to swallow them whole, to trap them in its endless, gaping maw. Down in the basement, the smell hit them first, a rancid, decayed odor that made their stomachs churn. It was darker than pitch, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything, even sound. Emily felt her way along the wall, her hand brushing against the cold, slimy surface of the stone. She couldn't see anything, couldn't make out any shapes in the suffocating dark. Then they heard it, a thud deep within the basement, a loud, wet sound like something heavy being dropped onto the floor. "Jacob?" Henry called out, his voice strained. The only response was the sound of something shifting in the darkness, something moving in the shadows. It was coming closer. Suddenly, a sharp screech echoed through the basement. The lights flickered back to life, but it was almost worse now. The pale light revealed the walls, twisted and shifting, writhing like living flesh, bending in unnatural angles. Something was climbing inside the walls, something hungry, something waiting. Emily felt her legs buckle beneath her. She collapsed to her knees, clutching at her chest, gasping for air. The house was suffocating her, pulling her into its depths. The walls seemed to close in on them, pushing them toward the center of the basement. "Henry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's coming." Then, from the far corner of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Jacob, but not. His eyes were wide, but they were empty, hollow, and his skin had a sickly, grayish hue. His mouth stretched into a grin, impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Mom, Dad, it wants you too." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The thing that stood before them, it looked like Jacob, but it was wrong. So wrong. Its skin was pale, stretched too thin, like a mask. Its eyes glowed with a sickly light, and its mouth, the smile that twisted its face, was too wide, its teeth too sharp. Henry stumbled backward, his heart pounding. "Jacob!" His voice was barely a whisper, trembling. "What's happened to you?" The thing that looked like Jacob stepped forward, dragging its feet across the floor, the scraping sound so familiar now. But the voice that came from it was wrong too. It wasn't his son's voice. It was something deeper, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away, from some dark, forgotten place. "It's hungry, Dad," it said, its voice low and slithering. "It always hungry, and now it wants more. More than just me." Emily tried to scream, but the words stuck in her throat, like the house itself was squeezing the life out of her. Henry backed up slowly, his eyes never leaving the creature in front of him. "What? What are you?" Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. The thing that was Jacob's face twisted, as if it were trying to smile, but there was no warmth in it, just an empty, horrifying grin. "I'm the thing in the walls. The thing that's always been here." It tilted its head, its eyes glinting in the dim light. "We're the same. All of us. You'll see soon enough." Emily's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the walls pressing in closer, the air growing thicker, like the house itself was closing around them. The smell of rot intensified, and suddenly, she was no longer sure she was standing in a basement at all. It felt like the world around them had shifted, like they were trapped in a twisted version of reality, a place where nothing was what it seemed. Henry reached out, his hands trembling, and touched the wall beside him. It was cold, too cold, almost like ice. He jerked his hand back as a sharp pain shot up his arm, a searing pain that made him gasp. "Henry, what's wrong?" Emily cried, rushing to his side. He looked at his hand in confusion. There, on his palm, were deep gouges, like something had scratched him from the inside of the wall. He could still feel it, that pull, that constant tug, like the house was reaching for him. "The house," he muttered under his breath. "It's alive. It's alive, Emily. It's trying to take us." Emily's voice trembled. "We have to get out of here. We have to." But the thing that was Jacob laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the basement. "It doesn't matter where you go. It's already too late." The walls groaned again, louder now, as if the house itself was stretching, shifting to accommodate whatever it had become. Emily felt the floor beneath her tremble, the whole house shuddering with the effort of change. "No!" Henry shouted, his voice breaking. "We can't just give up. We have to." Suddenly, the air grew cold, almost freezing, and the walls around them began to throb, pulsing like the heartbeat of something ancient, something terrible. The lights flickered again, revealing the truth. The basement wasn't just a basement anymore. It had turned into a hollow, an empty, dark expanse. The walls were no longer solid stone. They were flesh, writhing, undulating with something alive inside of them. The floor beneath them gave way, cracking with a loud, hollow sound, revealing a vast, endless abyss below. Emily screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness that stretched far beyond their sight. The house was no longer just a house. It had become something else, something alive, and it was no longer hiding its hunger. "It's going to take you," the thing that was Jacob whispered, its eyes gleaming with malice. "It always takes those who stay. There's no escape." Emily felt her stomach churn as the ground beneath her cracked open. The walls were moving in, pulling at her, pressing against her like the tendrils of a giant, suffocating creature. She reached out for Henry, but the house was pulling them apart. The thing that had once been her son laughed again, its laugh echoing, filling every corner of the nightmarish space around them. Henry grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her back as the floor crumbled beneath them. "We have to fight it. We have to." But before he could finish, the thing lunged at them, its mouth widening impossibly, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing as the thing's claws scraped the floor. It was faster than they could move, and it was getting closer. And then, in the blink of an eye, the thing vanished. The basement fell silent. For a long moment, neither Henry nor Emily moved. The world around them felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. The air was still and heavy, the oppressive, suffocating feeling lingering. But the thing that had been Jacob was gone. Emily's heart raced in her chest. "What was that? What is this place?" she whispered, almost to herself. Henry pulled her close, his grip tight. "We need to get out of here. Now." But it was too late. The house groaned, louder now, and the floor beneath them gave way completely. The darkness swallowed them both whole. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she felt herself falling. The world around her spun wildly, and she reached out in desperation, her hands clawing at the air, trying to find something to hold on to. But there was nothing. Nothing but the endless drop. She screamed, her voice lost in the vast, dark emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. The wind rushed past her, whipping at her face, filling her ears with a deafening roar. She didn't know how long she fell. Seconds? Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. Time had lost all meaning. Suddenly, with a sickening thud, Emily hit the ground, her body crumpling into the cold, rough earth. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, the pain in her body sharp and overwhelming. She lay there for a moment, too stunned to move, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Henry," she whispered, panic seizing her heart. "Henry, where are you?" But there was no answer, only the eerie silence of the void. Emily pushed herself up, her legs shaking, her mind reeling with confusion and fear. She couldn't see anything. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything around her. But she knew she had to keep moving. She had to find Henry. Her feet moved slowly, hesitantly at first, until she found the ground beneath her to be strangely firm, almost like concrete, but with an odd, wet feel to it. It was cold, unnaturally cold. She could feel the moisture rising from it, like the earth itself was exhaling a chill, a breath that carried with it a sense of wrongness, of decay. "Henry," she called again, her voice trembling. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, any movement, but there was nothing. Nothing but the unsettling silence of the chasm that surrounded her. And then, just as the silence began to smother her, she heard it. A soft, distant sound, almost like whispering. A voice. No, not a voice. More like a call. A sound that tugged at her, deep in her chest, pulling her forward. Her heart raced. It felt wrong. "Henry?" she asked again, but the whispering continued, growing louder, like a chorus of voices coming from every direction. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was watching her. Something was out there, in the dark. She forced herself to move, her legs trembling beneath her as she walked through the void. Every step felt like it took her deeper into a place where reality no longer existed, where nothing made sense. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a faint flicker of light. It was a small, dim glow, barely visible against the black expanse of the chasm. It seemed to move, shifting like a candle flame, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Without thinking, Emily moved toward it, her instincts driving her forward. Maybe it was Henry. Maybe it was the way out. But as she drew closer, the light grew stronger, and she realized that it wasn't a light at all. It was a window, a cracked, shattered window that hovered in the air, surrounded by an invisible frame. Through it, she could see a scene, her house. The house. But it wasn't the house they had entered. This place was different, darker. The walls were covered in shadows, and the windows were covered in grime, streaked with thick, black ooze. The furniture was overturned. The air was heavy with the smell of rot. It was like a nightmare, a twisted reflection of what it should have been. And then she saw them. Henry and Jacob. But they weren't themselves. Henry's face was twisted in pain, his eyes wide and empty. His hands pressed against the walls, as if he were trying to push them away, but the walls seemed to bend toward him, like the house itself was trying to swallow him whole. Jacob, or what had once been Jacob, stood beside him. It wasn't a boy anymore. It was a thing. Its body was wrong, distorted, with skin stretched taut over unnatural bone. Its eyes, those glowing eyes, stared out from the window, as if it could see her, could sense her presence in the dark. And then it spoke. "Mom." The voice was faint, but it was unmistakably Jacob's. "It's hungry. It's always hungry." Emily's heart froze in her chest. "What do you mean?" she whispered, but the words came out too quietly, too broken. The thing that had once been her son tilted its head, its grin growing wider, unnaturally wide. "It's not just the house anymore," it whispered. "It's the void. The darkness. It's taking us all. A shiver ran down Emily's spine as she felt the ground beneath her tremble, the darkness growing even thicker, suffocating her. She could feel the void around her pressing in, tightening like a noose. "No," she whispered, panic bubbling in her chest. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." But the whispering grew louder. The sound of movement, scraping against the ground. The air began to hum with energy. Something was coming. Something was getting closer. Suddenly, the window flickered, and the image of her family was gone, replaced by nothing. The light disappeared, leaving her alone in the darkness once more. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl from behind her, a sound that made her blood run cold. She turned around, but there was nothing there. Nothing, except for the deep, gaping darkness. And in the darkness, something moved. Emily's heart thudded in her chest, louder and louder, as the growl reverberated through the void. It was close now, so close. She could feel its presence, like a weight on her chest, pressing her down, suffocating her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but there was no sense to be made. The house, the chasm, the thing that had once been Jacob. Her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her forward in search of an escape that she couldn't find. She turned in every direction, but there was no way out. No way to break free from this darkness. The growling sound grew louder, then suddenly, there was a shifting sound behind her. Emily whirled around, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the darkness, she saw it. A shape. Something was moving toward her, slowly, steadily. Its outline was impossible to define, but its eyes, those glowing eyes, they pierced the dark just like Jacob's had, but this time they weren't mocking. They weren't human. It was large, towering, and it was coming for her. Emily stumbled backward, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. There was a shift in the air, a ripple that made her skin crawl, as though the very fabric of reality was warping around her. The ground beneath her felt like it was shifting, as though it were about to crack open. And then the thing spoke, its voice low and rumbling, like the echo of thunder. "You're still here," it said. "Still trying to escape. But it's too late. The house is hungry, and it always gets what it wants." It was the house itself, speaking through this twisted creature, this abomination. It had consumed Jacob, and now it wanted Emily. It wanted them all. "Where's Henry?" Emily cried, her voice cracking. She couldn't understand why she hadn't heard from him, why she couldn't find him. He had to be here. He had to be alive. The creature that wasn't Jacob tilted its head, its grin widening impossibly wide. "He's already part of it. He's already part of the house. Just like you will be." Emily's heart pounded as her mind raced. She couldn't just give up. There had to be something she could do. She couldn't let this thing, take her family. Suddenly, a flash of memory hit her like a lightning bolt. The house, the way it had always felt wrong, the whispers she'd heard at night, the way the walls seemed to shift, the floors that groaned like they were alive. This wasn't just a house. It was alive, and it was feeding on them. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I won't let you take me," she whispered, more to herself than to the creature. "I won't let you have us." But the creature just chuckled. "You think you can stop it? You think you can break the bond? The house knows you. It knows all of us. There is no escape from the hunger." Emily's thoughts raced. There had to be a way out. She had to outsmart the house, find a way to stop it from feeding. Her mind returned to the old relics, the old pieces of furniture she had seen when they first arrived. Those things that were out of place, the symbols on the walls that she couldn't quite understand. What if those symbols were a clue? A way to break the house's hold? "Where is it?" she whispered, the thought forming more clearly in her mind. "The relic. The one thing that could stop it." The creature's eyes narrowed. "You think you can stop it with trinkets and relics? You can't fight what you don't understand. You can't break the hunger. But Emily wasn't listening. She was already moving, her feet carrying her forward on instinct. She needed to find it. She needed to find the thing that could stop this nightmare. The ground trembled beneath her as the walls seemed to close in, but she ignored it, her heart pounding. There had to be something, anything, that could save them. She pushed forward through the dark, ignoring the way the air seemed to grow colder, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, as though the house itself was trying to drag her down, drown her in its hunger. Then she saw it, a glimmer of something, a faint light ahead. She followed it, her breath catching in her throat as she drew closer. It was the old library, the place she had visited earlier. She remembered the books, the strange, ancient volumes that had felt like they belonged to another time. She ran to them, desperate, her hands trembling as she pulled at the dusty tomes. There, buried beneath a pile of old books, was a small leather-bound journal. She yanked it free, flipping it open, praying that it would hold the key to escaping the horror that surrounded her. The pages were old and yellowed, but the writing was still clear. She scanned the words, her eyes widening as she read. The house, the void, they were one and the same, bound by an ancient curse. And the only way to stop it, the only way to break the bond, was to find the heart of the house, the thing that anchored it to the darkness. Emily gasped. The heart. It was hidden somewhere in the house, somewhere deep, and it was the only way to end this nightmare. But she had to act fast. The house was closing in on her. It was getting stronger, hungrier, and it wouldn't wait long. Emily's hands shook as she gripped the journal, the pages crinkling beneath her fingers. The words blurred together as her mind raced, trying to piece together the scattered fragments of knowledge that could save her. She had no time. The house was still breathing, still hungry, and it would consume her just as it had consumed Henry and Jacob. She glanced around, the eerie glow from the strange symbols on the walls casting unsettling shadows across the library. The whispers in the air grew louder, more urgent, like the house itself was aware of what she was doing. It felt like it was pressing in on her, suffocating her thoughts. The journal described the house's dark core, a central point of malevolent energy, where the house's true hunger was anchored. The void was a part of it, a force that existed alongside the house, feeding it, allowing it to grow, to stretch across dimensions. And the only way to sever the connection was to destroy the heart. The problem was, she had no idea where the heart was. She looked around the library, hoping for some clue, but the shelves were just as oppressive as the rest of the house, filled with more twisted, incomprehensible symbols. Then, through the haze of panic and confusion, she remembered something. The basement, the cold basement, where she'd heard the strange noises when they first arrived. The place that had felt like it was alive beneath her feet. She hadn't dared to go down there, but now, with no other choice, it seemed like the only place left to search. The journal didn't offer specific instructions on where to find the heart, but it mentioned that it was hidden beneath the house, deep within the foundation. And the foundation was in the basement. Without another thought, Emily shoved the journal into her bag, her mind determined, and hurried toward the door. As she moved, the whispers seemed to chase her, wrapping around her like a thick fog. She could feel the house's presence pressing in on her, pushing against her every step, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her footsteps echoed through the empty halls as she made her way to the basement door. Each creak of the floorboards sounded louder, the air colder. The door to the basement loomed ahead, its rusty hinges creaking in the silence. She grasped the handle, hesitated for only a moment, and then opened it. The stairwell down to the basement was cloaked in darkness, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The narrow staircase seemed to stretch on forever, each step feeling heavier than the last. Emily's pulse quickened as she descended, the house groaning in protest beneath her feet. The deeper she went, the more alive the house seemed to become. The walls trembled, the floor creaked as though something huge was shifting beneath her. She could hear faint scratching noises, whispers, voices that didn't sound human, but she pressed on, determined to find the heart and end this nightmare. When she reached the bottom, the air was thick, almost suffocating. The basement was much larger than she had expected, stretching out into the inky blackness. There were shelves of old, forgotten tools, boxes of moth-eaten clothing, and an oppressive feeling that everything in this place was waiting for something to give in, to be consumed. She stood in the center of the room, trying to steady her breath. The whispers were gone, replaced by an unsettling silence, but something was still there, something watching her. The floor beneath her feet was cold and uneven. She scanned the room for anything that might stand out, something that could lead her to the heart of the house. And then she saw it. In the far corner, half hidden beneath a pile of rotting boards, was a large old chest. The edges were covered in dust, the wood warped with age, but there was something about it that made Emily's skin crawl. She couldn't explain it. It felt wrong, but it also felt like the answer. With a trembling hand, Emily approached the chest. She could feel the air around it pulsing, like it was alive, like the house itself was holding its breath. She crouched down, her fingers brushing against the edges of the chest. The wood was smooth but cold, and the closer she got, the more she could feel an unease settling into her bones. She tried to push the chest open, but it was stuck, frozen in place. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at it, heart pounding. But then, without thinking, she yanked at the lid with all her strength. There was a moment of resistance, and then the chest popped open with a sharp creak. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. At first, Emily thought it was empty, but as her eyes adjusted to the shadows, she saw it. A single blackened heart. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, twisted, shriveled, and pulsating with a sickly, otherworldly glow. It was like the very essence of the house, a thing that didn't belong in this world. The heart was attached to something that looked like roots, spreading deep into the ground, twisting through the earth beneath her feet. The moment she saw it, she knew. This was it, the heart of the house, the thing that kept it alive, the source of its hunger. But as she reached for it, the ground shuddered beneath her feet, and the house screamed. The floor beneath Emily's feet trembled violently as a deep, guttural roar echoed from the very walls around her. The chest in front of her rattled as though the house itself was trying to close it again, to swallow the heart back into its dark embrace. The room seemed to stretch and contort, and the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure, as though the house was about to collapse in on itself. Emily's heart raced, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She couldn't waste any more time. She had to destroy it. If she didn't, everything would be lost. The house, the void, it would consume her, her family, and the entire world. With a shaking hand, she reached into the chest, her fingers brushing against the pulsating heart. It was ice cold, yet burning hot at the same time, like it was pulling all the heat from her body. The roots attached to it seemed to react, writhing, twisting under her touch as if trying to pull her into the ground. The moment her fingers made contact, the world around her ripped apart. The walls of the basement distorted, bending at impossible angles. The house groaned like it was coming to life, an unnatural, nightmarish sound that made her bones ache. She could hear voices, screams, rising from the dark void beneath the house. Whispers of her family, of Jacob, of Henry, calling out to her in agonizing pain, urging her to stop. But Emily knew what she had to do. She had to end it. "No!" she shouted, pulling with all her strength, her fingers curling around the heart. She could feel the roots tightening around her wrist, but she didn't let go. Her other hand grabbed for the journal in her bag, flipping to the page where she had read about the heart's destruction. There was a single sentence, one line that was barely legible through the ink stains. To destroy the heart, you must burn it in the house's own blood. The words hit her like a hammer. Blood. The house had blood. It was alive. It fed. She just had to get to the heart of it. The world around her warped further, the ground shifting, as if it was opening to swallow her whole. The chest creaked, its wood splintering with unnatural force, and suddenly, a wave of heat rushed through the room, so hot that Emily's skin burned, her lungs screamed for air. The roots beneath her feet twitched violently. The pulse of the heart grew faster, louder, until it was a deafening roar in her ears. Her heart raced to match its rhythm. She couldn't waste any more time. She ripped the heart from the chest, feeling its icy coldness and raw power course through her veins. It throbbed in her hands, as though it were alive. And in some twisted way, Emily realized it was. The ground beneath her buckled, and she staggered backward, almost falling as the room seemed to tilt. She could feel the house's hunger, its claws reaching out for her. The air thickened, suffocating her as she scrambled toward the stairs, the heart burning in her hands. She had to get out. She had to find the blood. The door to the basement slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash, but Emily didn't stop. She charged up the stairs, the house groaning and shifting with every step. The walls were closing in, but she forced herself forward, ignoring the way the floor threatened to collapse beneath her feet. She didn't know where the blood was, but she could feel it. Upstairs. She burst into the main hall, her chest heaving as she sprinted down the corridor. The walls seemed to pulse around her, breathing, reacting to her every move. The house was alive, and it was getting stronger. But Emily could sense something else too, something deeper, more ancient. At the end of the hall, she found it. The old grandfather clock. It was a massive, ornate thing that had always felt out of place in the house. But now, in this moment, Emily saw it for what it truly was. The clock wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was the heart of the house, the pulse that kept it alive. The clock was covered in dark stains, blackened in places like something had been spilled over it long ago. But there was a spot beneath it, a scar on the floor, where the blood had pooled over the years. The house's blood. It was here. Her hands shook, but she didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees, placing the heart next to the dark stain on the floor. The moment the heart touched the ground, the house screamed. It was a sound of pure rage, a roar that rattled the windows and shook the foundation. The heart pulsed wildly, and Emily quickly grabbed it and shoved it into the blood, watching as the veins of the house lit up in red, a sickly glow spreading out from the floorboards like fire. The house trembled. The walls shook violently. The roar grew louder. The blood burned, and the house felt as if it were about to collapse into the chasm, taking everything with it. But then suddenly there was silence. The air went still. The world felt as though it had stopped moving. Emily gasped for breath, looking around in disbelief. The house felt empty. The oppressive pressure had lifted. The choking atmosphere was gone. But the silence that followed was worse than anything she had felt before. It was an unnatural stillness, one that hung in the air, heavy and thick. And then it happened. The house, the very ground beneath her, began to fall. The floorboards cracked, the walls buckled, and the ceiling above her splintered. The house was collapsing, breaking apart as the last remnants of the void fought to hold on to its power. Emily didn't look back. She ran, running through the collapsing hallways, the house groaning in agony around her. She could hear it, its final death cries, the screeches of its decay, the wailing of the thing that had been alive for so long. And then, just as the house seemed to fall apart, she broke through the front door, out into the open air. The ground shook one last time. The house, now nothing more than a pile of splintered wood and rubble, disappeared into the chasm. It was over. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.